All right. Recording has started. What's up, Nick? It's good to see
What's up,
you.
Tom? It's good to be back.
Yeah, obviously we talk outside of doing these recordings, so it's not like there's been a year or however long since we've last talked.
True.
We've talked plenty since then, but we decided to do a bit more of these, I guess you could say. We got some inspiration or some encouragement from hearing about other people, not in my personal life, but I guess in Nick's life,
hmm
who had used the videos and had watched them, which we thought was cool, and we thought, not to give ourselves too much self-importance, was something that we could keep doing in a more limited, direct capacity.
Yeah.
So we're coming back to talk, and I think we have a wide list of topics today. Some are more current event,
Mhm.
politics based, and some are broader, more consistent things that have been occurring, or their reflections or observations on things that have been going on for a long time.
Yeah.
So
And to add on to that, so even beyond, the few people who have reached out and told me that they like to watch them, sometimes on repeat, sometimes to, teach others how to have productive discourse, whatever. I think it's also good for us because I like to go back sometimes and just see, what we used to think, or, it's a good, no, I'm serious, like it's a good archive
I
for
know,
us
yeah,
and
I'm
our.
honestly scared of all that.
I mean, sure. Yeah, I mean, I've definitely said some things that were kind of outrageous in the past, but it's a great way for us to, document our philosophical, growth in our journeys. So, yeah, I think you wanted to start off with current events and with the debate. And I know nothing about this, so you can teach me.
Yeah, and I know a little bit about it. So the debate is coming up. This episode should be out before the debate actually happens.
Okay.
And it's Trump and Biden again. And so this will be with their fourth debate together. Because did they do three for
Yep, they did
2020?
three. Yep.
Now they are no longer using the independent debate council, or the group that used to run the debates. I believe it's now being entirely run through the news organizations. So I want to say that the first debate will be on CNN. There's only going to be two debates as opposed to the traditional three debates that we've been used to,
Mm.
at least for 2016 and for 2020. It was three debates on three different networks with three different hosts, or three
Mhm.
different sets of debate moderators.
Right.
Uh, and so I think it used to be Fox, CNN, and then NBC. And now it's just CNN and NBC, or CNN and Fox. But what's interesting is that they've removed this independent, or like seemingly independent element of the debate committee. And, both candidates have agreed to terms. So one of the bigger innovations that's happening now is that, well, innovation is a strong word, is that they the moderators have the right to cut the mics of the participants if they go over their allotted speaking time. And so it's interesting that Trump agreed to that. I think, but so they will have the ability to mute them and to stop them from speaking if they go over their time.
Mm.
And I think another thing that's interesting, that a lot of people are speculating that Trump and Biden are going to be heavily medicated for this.
Oh, yeah.
And there's no way to prove that. I in my heart believe that's how it's going to be. The same way, like when Biden gave his State of the Union, it felt he had a lot more energy than we were typically used to from him, and maybe even coherence.
Yeah,
But
it's
I don't know. The debates historically, there's a lot of interesting debate history. You go back, and this was not a presidential debate, but like the Lincoln Douglas debate
mm.
was so prominent that it created a style of debate, or speech and debate, like a format. And then you look back and you have with John F. Kennedy versus Nixon. There's famously the story that Bobby turned up the heat and Nixon's makeup started running, and that he began to stammer and whatnot. But I believe today the debates do not have much of an effect on the actual outcome of the election. And I don't know when the last time they would have. I mean, with like Mitt Romney did very poorly at the debate, I recall, for 2012. And I think beyond that, though, one, the way that they're formatted and the way that they're moderated has drastically changed. And I also think the type of candidates we have running has drastically changed.
Sure.
Because you look back at these old debates and like from a perspective of politics, both candidates used to be a lot closer together. And so they were disagreeing on a lot more minutia. And the
Mm.
questions were structured much more around socioeconomics and about global and foreign policy. Whereas today, I feel there's a much more time spent on cultural questions. Like I think that's something we see very often.
Yeah,
And so I
that's
think yeah,
well,
there'll be
that's
a
an
lot of
astute
time.
analysis.
Yeah, I think there'll be a lot of time spent talking about abortion and talking about maybe trans rights. I think climate change will be the only step. Will be one of the only big like forays into discussions on economic. Well, actually, I don't know. I think there will be discussions on whether or not the economy is good. And Biden, we'll talk about this with the CPI numbers later. Biden's been trying to argue, and his camp has been trying to argue that the economy is in a very good place, and that the numbers are reflective of that. So we'll see. But I doubt there'll be that much conversation on economics. And I think will be a lack of coherence and a lack of clear, understandable thought among these guys. And I think that is just a trend. But if you look at it today, I think the debates do not impact the election from a who's going to win standpoint. They can show us some things and they can maybe tell us stuff, but they are not going to be these great indicators or these great moments of change. And another big thing for these debates is that there's no audience anymore, which will be interesting to see, which I feel as though the audience is much more important for something like the primaries, where people can swing crowds who are all quote unquote on the same team. But whereas these other debates, I guess, I don't know if they try to split the audience. I don't know if it's like, for the Super Bowl, they try to ensure that a certain amount of fans from each team go. I don't know if they did that for the prior debates, but I mean, I will be watching. I don't think you have to watch. Like we talk about having a discourse and trying to show the ideas of being informed and whatnot, but I don't think it's going to teach anybody anything about these candidates and the type of people that both Trump and Biden want to vote for them. The undecided voter is not going to begin to make their decisions until about a month before the election. And so things will be over by then.
I think number one is, I kind of want to hit a few different topics you discussed there.
Mm-hmm.
The emphasis on social issues is, in my opinion, I think that just shows like the breakdown of American politics. Like you really got your economic, your social, and your international, like your foreign policy issues. And this may not be true, but I heard from a professor of mine in college that there used to be one debate for each of those, and like the questions would focus on one of the three.
Yes, I think so, and I think that does go back a long time. But the debates used to be structured on a specific issue, right, and the candidates would come prepared with the policies that they would attempt to implement.
Right, and this professor was telling me about that, and he's approximately 64. So he looks like he's 40, but separate discussion. What's it called? So he tells me, that each of the debates had a different topic, and you mentioned how there's no two. So which one do they get rid of? Well, unfortunately, they're going to keep social issues. Unfortunately, that's my view. But what are they going to get rid of? They're probably going to get rid of foreign policy, if I had to guess, or they're going to mix econ and foreign policy, because I think Trump and Biden actually agree on foreign policy. They both want to bomb Gaza. They both want to be belligerent towards Russia. They both want to defend Taiwan. I mean, really, where do these guys disagree on foreign policy?
It is funny that foreign policy, even their policy on immigration, is fundamentally the same, even if there will be arguments that they're different.
Rhetoric is different.
Yeah, the rhetoric, exactly. But I don't know. I think from a perspective of like, if you imagine yourself as the CNN, the director or the producers of this debate, you want, from a viewership and engagement perspective, them to talk about Israel-Palestine. And I think what they're both going to do Well, I actually don't know what Biden would do. I would assume that Trump is going to actually say that Biden is not being hard enough
Yes,
and
that
is
is what
going
he's
to
been.
try to double down onto that and then try to say the types of things he would do. And then I think, I don't know, maybe Biden will blame Trump for them being in this situation and imply that throughout the 4 years leading up to it has caused that. But you're right, because both are so pro-Israel. And Trump is in some ways, I mean, as a president, did things that from a gesture standpoint were more pro-Israel than even Biden.
Yeah.
Like he was a part of declaring the location of the embassy.
Yep, to Jerusalem, not Tel
And
Aviv.
or I guess that, and then that was a declaration of the capital.
Yep.
And so that was a very controversial thing.
Mhm.
And I mean, we've seen it with Biden and everything that's been going on, but even Trump at rallies has said like very, very like quote unquote Zionist or pro-Israel comments.
Well,
And if you look, Jared Kushner, the type of work he was doing in the Middle East was very like pro-Israel and was about supporting the state of Israel. So I think that will be a big staple point. I think abortion will be the other big thing,
mhm.
and we'll be asking about that and talking about the Supreme Court's decision behind it and the idea of pointing fingers for it, it being Trump's fault because of the justices that he appointed.
Mm.
So I
Well,
think those will be yeah.
yeah, so with Jared Kushner, just to add some more context to what you said, what Jared was doing was he was going around the Middle East and acting as the intermediary to broker peace between Israel and multiple Middle Eastern nations. And he was doing that by this is a theory. So that first part is definitely true, but this part's a theory. It's suspected that like the Trump administration was just giving information or favors to different Middle Eastern countries and using those favors as essentially a trade for peace with Israel. I mean, one example would be, once again, this is speculated, but I think it's true, that the United States gave a list to bin Salman, the dictator of Saudi Arabia, of all of his political enemies, because we spy on all of them and we were like, this is where they live. And then bin Salman killed like 200 people.
Oh my
So
God.
that's like, and we know for a fact that like he killed all of his enemies in a short period of time. But I think the suspect would be that like we knew that information and we gave it over to him. That's like an example.
He's just Walter White in the jail,
Right.
killing the
Yeah, exactly.
killing the informants in a minute
Yes.
or under 2 minutes. Yeah.
Another example would be with Oman. He gave them a ton of
Mhm.
intelligence as well. So I think that's a good example. And unfortunately, when Israel launched their brutal invasion of Gaza, a lot of those relations have broken down. So, I won't get into that right now because we're doing the debate. But when we get to Israel, which will be our next topic,
Well, if we want to segue into it too,
wait, I just wanted to wrap up on the debate by saying that
yeah.
I think that a moment ago you said that people like us, civilians, aren't really going to learn anything from the debate. And that it's unfortunate that I think with social media and with just cable news in general, it's really just both candidates fighting for like a 15-second gotcha soundbite. So there's and the nature of that combative nature to play into the short attention span of the media and unfortunately to our people results in a lot of interrupting. It results in a lot of nonsensical discussions, grand gestures, false promises, so we've moved away from the sophistication of, like you said, although the Kennedy and Nixon debate was a debacle, right, with the makeup, it was actually like a pretty substantive debate if you go back and watch it.
Yes. And it's over. You look back and it's watching it today. You're like, okay, this isn't that big of a deal. Obviously, Kennedy looks far better
Mhm.
on camera and is much more presentable than
Right.
Nixon, but it's not like either of these guys are schlubs. Whereas today it's we're expecting more dribble and babble than we are anything of substance or anything that's reasonable or logically consistent.
Yeah.
I think there's going to be a lot of name calling. I think, like I said, the mics being able to be turned off will be interesting. It'll be
Mhm.
interesting to see how that impacts things.
Are they going to do it? Because it's one thing to have the ability to, but are they going to execute on that? That's
Well,
interesting.
one thing it made me think of is that Andrew Yang accused during the Democratic primary debates, he accused, I don't know if it was NBC or CNN, I think probably CNN handles a lot of the primary debates, accused them of muting his mic.
Mm,
And it was not something built into the, oh, you get muted if you go over your time. He claimed that if that he was muted at various points during these early primaries, and this is way back in, I guess, 2019. Uh, but during that, when other candidates were being given favor in terms of speaking, and so I never knew if that was proven or whatnot. I believe
probably
I don't
true.
want to say I don't want to say definitively because my memory might be failing me, but I believe there are clips where it's focused in on him attempting to speak and just nothing is coming out in terms of sound.
Yeah.
And so,
Here on the, I think that here on the No Good News podcast, we take a stance and we stand by it. So they were
okay,
muting.
there we go. We'll say,
Yeah.
yeah, as a news source, but we can use this moment to turn to talking about Israel and Palestine in general, because I mean, I think that's the
Sad.
move. Yeah. And I think from a broader like from an an Americentric perspective, it's the main cultural war
Mm-hmm.
prevailing at this moment,
Yes.
because it's, instead of it being a divide against right or left, it's a divide between, for the most part, and obviously there's a lot of exceptions to this, and this is a generalization, but you can see the concentration of support is for Palestine is in the younger demographic, and the concentration of support is in the older demographic.
It's the Vietnam
And
situation.
it is. And it is a situation where all of our previous, like a lot of the major things that are, I don't know, you could almost argue are designed in a sense, or maybe it's just a lot of serendipity and it's a lot of natural cause. But a lot of other things that we consider a part of a quote unquote cultural war is pretty evenly a divide between right and left. Like abortion, is a right or left. And there might be some age stuff related to that as well. I mean, that's also a difficult thing where it's like the Republican Party is the older party at the same time. But that's what's made this issue so interesting, is that you have, it's almost like the left or Democrats, I won't say the left, is the Democratic Party has really been divided into two groups. And I think that is something that people have noted is a historical aspect of the Democratic Party in the last 20 to 30 years, is they experience a lot more infighting, whereas the Republican Party is much more unified and willing to stand pat. And we've seen that with Trump.
Mm-hmm.
Like, they're, for the third time, he's their guy after everyone has, whether it's Ted Cruz or Rubio or all these guys who have gone up against him and lost, who have now bent the knee. Whereas in the Democratic Party, they're really a lot more split on this issue. And it's been very interesting to see. And I think that split is also an age split.
Yeah, of course. I mean, so personally, I'm definitely, with the youth on this. I think that Israel's gone too far. I mean, obviously at first, the country gets attacked. There's now intelligence suggesting that Israel knew it was going to happen.
Yeah, and there had been reports about that initially after October 7th, but there was, I don't think, with everything that was happening from a news perspective, that was not going to be one of the top stories.
No.
And people compare this moment, the October 7th, to September 11th in a lot of ways. And that is one of the ways in which it could be a more direct comparison. Though then there's even greater accusations that might start to lean in towards the more conspiratorial type of information that we had with 9/11, where people started to believe that it was a quote unquote inside job.
Yeah, so I don't think it was an inside job, but I do think Israel knew. I mean, the Gaza's so small and it's like so heavily surveilled. They were doing like mock trainings in the streets in Gaza. And we now know this, that they were like building fake cities and like mapping where they were going to enter. Like, Israel definitely knew this was going to happen. But even beyond that, the response from Israel has been so extreme. I mean, if you want to annex Gaza, just be honest about it. So then we can move forward. Because that's what I think Israel wants to do. I think they want to annex Gaza, at least the north half, right? And, but they're pretending that they're going in and like, cleansing the area of Hamas terrorists. But you can't cleanse Gaza of Hamas. It's like their dominant political party. Like you just can't do that.
Yes. And beyond that, if you're looking at it from a perspective of strategy, when you're fighting against a guerrilla group, like
Mm-hmm.
a guerrilla warfare group, a group that has been, it was elected in the technical sense. Part of it is the idea that it exists to fill a vacuum of power.
Yep.
And then if we want to draw further comparisons to September 11th, that there's evidence that Hamas had received funding
From Israel.
as Israel to combat the PLO.
Mm-hmm.
And which once again, it's like poetry, it rhymes with some of the ways that this is reflective, and then in some of the ways, to me, it makes sense that America's stance is so strong on this, because so much of it is, a lot of what Israel is doing is stuff that I think the United States would do in the similar situation.
Yep.
Except it's very different from geography, and the history and the animosity goes back way, way longer. And so that's what makes this such a messy issue. But I think there is this idea, and one thing that people don't really talk about, and I remember was kind of a big deal, is that in the summer of 2023, there was a strong possibility, it was probable and it was plausible, that Netanyahu could have been
Dethroned.
not taken out, but dethroned. Like, taken out implies killed, but that he would have been removed from his seat as the PM, because he was trying to exert a lot of executive control over the judicial court system in Israel. And there were mass protests, especially in Tel Aviv, and the public opinion on Netanyahu before October 7th was very low. And people were fed up with him. They were talking about bringing criminal charges onto him. He was facing trial, I guess not in a strict legal sense, but he was, committees and investigations. Yeah, he was not in a true trial, but he was being investigated, and he was having to speak in front of their system. And now it's like October 7th really changed everything and changed the priorities a lot. And so if you put on your tinfoil hat, exactly, if you think of it from a conspiracy level, regardless of how much planning was done to ensure October 7th happened, or if there was any planning involved, it has been a very advantageous thing for Netanyahu and his allies within the Israeli government.
Yeah, the what's the name of their party? Likud? I think that's right.
Yeah.
Something like that.
Yeah.
But no, I'm gonna continue on with that. The Israel response, there's tape. We have Netanyahu on tape back when he had hair on his head. This is so a long time ago. And he is literally saying on video that they are going to prop up Hamas to defeat the PLO, because then Hamas will be easier to attack and ostracize on the world stage. So like, that's it, plain and simple. So this invasion that Israel is conducting right now is a culmination of Netanyahu's plan over the last 25 years. And they're going to do whatever it takes. They're going to obfuscate. They're going to lie. They're going to say that UN employees are members of Hamas, right?
And which happened in a moment. It was UNRWA, which is the UN group that works exclusively in the Palestinian territories. They, I think, have over 10,000 or over 15,000 employees, and they fired 14 that I guess they felt like in some way were tangentially involved in the incident. They were not like, I believe when I was reading about it that they were not like, they weren't shooting people, the people they fired. It was more about their support for Hamas was what structured it. But this idea that the United Nations is even there are far right Israeli groups that accuse of America of not acting enough in Israel's favor. So there's a lot of extremism going on,
Well, I mean,
which if you hear that as like from America, and then the other thing we have to remember is that, Netanyahu is Israeli, but he grew up in America and in a lot of ways is just as American as you or me, like at his age.
I think he's
He
like
went
a
to high.
CIA plant.
Okay, well, I don't
No,
look
like
us go that far, but yeah,
he clearly has connections to like American intelligence. Like we obviously
yes.
talk to him often. He's basically a puppet in my view.
Well, sometimes I feel like we're more puppets than to
Okay, that's
them,
true. He's
and so
getting
that's some.
that's true.
It's hard. It's hard to determine puppet and puppet master and who's in charge. Sometimes, I mean, I felt like with the embassy attacks
Mhm.
on Iran,
Yep.
that was them trying to goad us into supporting them for more expansive conflict and expansive war, because Iran obviously is one of the biggest supporters of Hamas, and one of out of all of these Middle Eastern countries that have a disdain for Israel, Iran has a really big disdain, and there's a lot of financial evidence and backing
Yeah.
in history that shows that.
They launched the
Uh,
missiles. They launched, I forget the number, but it was like what, 100, 200? I forget the number.
yeah,
Missiles at Israel. Israel shot them all down because the travel time for a missile between the two is actually quite lengthy. So they were able to shoot them all down. But no, you're right. I mean, if we were to tangent on this, Netanyahu has been doing a lot of things that we as America have told him not to do, and then he
yes,
does those things. For example, bombing hospitals, bombing.
yeah, Ashifa, the Ashifa
Yeah,
hospital.
I mean that's just one. That's just one of the
Oh
hospitals.
yeah, that was the biggest example, and that was the one where they had the silly news reports that they found all the guns in the radiology
Yeah,
department, and they found them at what's it called? Not a cat, the MRI scanner.
yeah, that makes no sense because
The idea
obviously
that
you can't put
yeah,
metal in an MRI room. But you know, then what happens is he does things that we don't approve of, and then he asks for permission after he does that. And this, just from a purely selfish American standpoint, like we are in charge, like we are the empire. You got to listen to us. Like they're causing problems for us, and they're weakening our. It's gotten to the point now where Israel's actions are weakening our relationships in the region. And yes, we bear some responsibility for that because we're allying with them. But they've done such extreme things that now you have Saudi Arabia, who was a quote ally of the United States, very strategically important ally in the region. Now, like they're taking sides against us, and now
well,
they're negotiating peace with Iran. Like it's just getting out of hand, and we have to step in and basically, remind Israel that we are in charge, not them. They get all their weapons from us. It's ridiculous.
yeah, they get a lot of their funding and their money from the United States. I mean, Saudi Arabia they're like the other side of the same coin, where they constantly did the type of things that you would never do to an ally. Like, so they helped facilitate and orchestrate in aspects 9/11.
True. OPEC
And
manipulation with oil.
there's OPEC and OPEC plus manipulation. And then when they cut up the American journalist, I don't want to say his name, pronounce
Jamal
his name.
Khashoggi.
Yes, Khashoggi. Like those are pretty big defiant things, or
Yeah.
defiant actions that Saudi Arabia has perpetrated against us.
Mhm.
And obviously we're no stranger to doing that to other countries. But I agree, like focusing on this issue, there's a lot of ways to focus on it. And I think when we discuss about it, want to prioritize focusing on America's involvement in the conflict,
Right.
because that's a more rational way of discussing it. And when I speak of if something's rational or irrational, I don't mean to say that if something's irrational, that somebody's unintelligent or they're not smart.
Hmm.
It's just the perspective surrounding it. And so it's like in the case of the Israel-Palestine debates within the United States, the ones that are more popular are really the ones on the morality of the conflict and the way that Israel is conducting the war. And there's obviously people discuss U.S. support, but then a lot of it is like on the pro-Palestinian side, talking about how they're, because they're also against a two-state solution, or a lot of the people who protest for that. And then there's the controversy with the use of the from the river to the sea terminology.
It's
Like,
such a
both
nonsense.
sides are very extreme, and it becomes a very irrational debate.
Yeah.
Whereas from a rational perspective, if you're talking about what is achievable, maybe through protest in the United States, like
Mm.
eliminating the state of Israel is not achievable and not
Right.
rational
But also,
from a pragmatic perspective. So we're more
yes.
interested in focusing on, how should the U.S. be involved, and should they be taking sides on this, and
So what
should
do
we
you
really
think
be
next?
spending all this money on it? I
How's
mean,
what's your argument look like?
so like I know you're a big, but like regardless of if we're in decline or not, we're the empire, and we're number one. And
Yes.
so we have this global influence that we need to be aware of, and we need to take into consideration. And I
Mm.
think Israel is so imprinted, or we're so imprinted onto Israel, and then in some ways Israel's very imprinted onto us, and it's
Yeah.
this weird snake eating itself
Mhm.
situation. uh but I would say that my perspective and my reflection on it is that I don't see why we have to so vehemently support Israel. And I think especially that APAC is a really venomous, uh,
Institution.
un- un-American, and I mean un-American in a lot of ways. I mean un-American in the sense that it's from Israel, like it's a
Mm.
lobby that supports a different country.
Yep.
And the idea that the fact that people are making all of these policy decisions based on the ideas and the figures of another country,
Mm.
I find really problematic,
Oh yeah.
because it's not, like America first is a term that it gets thrown around in very far right ways or in very conservative ways. And I don't want to be an isolationist, and I don't believe in isolationism. But this idea that we should be letting other countries so heavily influence our decision making on a political scale and on a legislative scale
Yep.
is really frightening to me.
Agreed.
I personally believe, given based on the comments made by Nikki Haley, Mitt Romney, Mnuchin, when they and in the discussion on the TikTok ban.
Okay.
So like I think the TikTok ban, people have a lot of opinions on it, but I think it's was motivated through TikTok's appeal to younger people and the discussion and news about the Israel-Palestine conflict. Now, I don't think that's the only reason that the ban occurred, but I think that was a heavy influential factor. And
Mm.
there's even a clip of Romney and Mnuchin talking about how they were concerned with the PR that Israel was getting
On
because
TikTok.
on TikTok.
Interesting.
And then Nikki Haley is you could say is a I find it a famous quote, saying that by going on TikTok it makes you 17% more anti-Semitic.
It's funny. I haven't
Which is,
heard that one. That's funny.
it's a funny percentage, but I
Yeah.
think like so that's I don't know. The TikTok is like that the most important thing. There's other ways to look at it. Do I think TikTok is good? No, I think it's bad for us. But I do think, besides it being an anti-competitive decision by a country that, and I know China, they play with different rules and whatnot, but this
Mhm.
idea that that we always want to be competitive and capitalist, and then we make these types of decisions, and then it feels like part of these decisions are being made by the fact that Israel doesn't like how much promotion is occurring
Right.
for the Palestinian support groups.
What you're saying is
Yeah.
what you're saying is you don't support the reasons why the ban is being discussed. You would prefer if the ban is being discussed on like impacts on our children, impacts on our society, but what you're unhappy about is that it's being discussed through the lens of, well, Israel looks really bad on TikTok
Well, it's just crazy for me to be making these decisions into making things illegal for
based off
another
another
country.
country. Yeah.
So another example of this is that that law getting passed that was talking about anti-Semitism, that included a very nebulous, uh, you know, uh, difficult to define clause regarding how anti-Semitism could refer to people being critical of the
Israel.
state of Israel as it associates to Jewish people. I think that is, I'm paraphrasing, but I think it was a very difficult term, and it did not it lacked clarity and it lacked precision, which I think these laws often do.
Yep.
But that stuff was able to get through, and that's the thing. We also talked about how slow the American government is. The TikTok ban, the second they had the motivation behind it, and they got AIPAC involved, and Mnuchin and Romney and these big power players who are pro-Israel, that bill got through quick. Like it getting read and it getting proposed, and then you look at how much slower all these other things get through, and it's just crazy that our government is so disorganized and not unified whatsoever until an issue like this, where you have Chuck Schumer saying, Chuck Schumer saying that like he will always stand for Israel and like die for, he didn't say die for Israel. I don't want us to go that far, but it's just insane to me. It's like, I thought we were Americans and that we made decisions for Americans. And now we're making all of these decisions for or because of Israel. And another thing is that following October 7th, it was revealed that a few millions of dollars were spent by Israel to flood and to manipulate like algorithms and the suggested news of members of Congress.
What? No.
Yeah. So this is happening. Now I think I doubt we have any non-American listeners. I don't know, maybe not, but they might go, if they're from certain countries, they might be like, well, this is what America has always done to other places. And I acknowledge that and acknowledge that it's wrong.
Right. But it's not okay when they do it to us.
Well, I don't think it's okay when it happens in general, but I'm saying as somebody who is experiencing it, it's like you can really understand how ridiculous it feels that all of this is happening.
Yeah. No, I totally agree. But on a more ironic note, it's not okay when they do it to us. I don't like that.
Yeah, from a perspective of exposure, I think it's also really difficult. Like you look at the way that the press has been organized, and so like this isn't a federal or a global example, but talking about suppression and abusing the idea of what it means to be anti-Semitic to somebody, like the Washington Post published an article where they found that there was a group chat through WhatsApp that was filled with prominent New York millionaires, businessmen, I think some of whom were Jewish. I don't know if all of whom were Jewish. And that these texts revealed that they were pressuring the NYPD to take a more violent and take a more aggressive militaristic approach against the Columbia protesters. And so this article comes out, and then the deputy chief of police of New York, it's not like sues, but almost charged the Washington Post with promoting anti-Semitism.
It's just ridiculous. It's just the influence that AIPAC and this is not anti-Semitic, but like the Jewish influence has in the United States.
I would say not a Jewish influence, an Israeli influence.
Right, but that's fair. That's fair.
But I'm saying because I think like there's a lot of Jewish people who are not in favor of the war. I think there's a lot of Israeli people who are Jewish and living in Israel who are not supporting the way that this war is being conducted. So I mean, it's hard to make distinctions because it's like you and I both don't believe in this idea of a Jewish conspiracy.
No.
Like it's not organized that way, but I think it's clear that you can root things to looking at how the state of Israel is operating in the United States and the type of people who have connections and support to that. And I think that's completely reasonable to declare and to state. And then when you have guys like Chuck Schumer who are declaring their unabashed love and constant support for Israel, where it's like, you had to agree and to swear to serve
the
United
American
States.
Constitution.
Yeah.
Like where's your authority and where's your conscience in terms of the people you represent? Clearly that is not present on this matter.
And we're so used to this happening with like corporations instead of it being Israel, which is like, it's kind of normal at this point. Like when
Yeah.
individuals and congressmen and people in positions of power bow to like corporations.
Yep.
Like that was at least normal. This is
Yes.
such a different thing occurring, and it just feels so much more obvious and blatant in a way in which
Yes.
it's so different and new, and it's just a gross experience.
Yeah.
And I know just from that perspective alone, not even focusing on the tragedy and the senseless violence and the torture and the death that's occurring in
Hmm.
Israel and Palestine, it's just crazy what's been going on. And I think part of that is why there's such a disconnect between young and old.
Yep.
And I think, though I don't know how much, young people who are pro-Palestinian are not like the type of people, I don't know, they're like very heavy into ideological politics. They're very heavy into things like diversity, equity, and inclusion. So I think that's also a barrier between young and old that we're seeing that's being reflected in a different way. I don't know if you had thoughts on that.
Um, I just think it's probably, I think the young and old thing, I think another element, because I've spoken to some of my friends, is amongst young people, especially young men, there's like a legitimate concern that if this conflict breaks out, that like we are the people that have to go fucking die in Gaza, and like we would have to like fight in this war. And like I'm not exaggerating. That's a legitimate concern. Like this is
Yeah, and
a war I would want to fight in. I don't
and
support this cause.
like the people who protested Vietnam, or the types of people who said that they would protest Vietnam, like are the same people now who are saying that they think mandatory service would be a good thing, and
Yeah.
that bringing back the draft would potentially be a good thing. And we're starting to see those first steps taken, which I'm surprised we didn't have this on our list talking about the selective service.
Yep.
Uh,
For everyone up to 26 years old.
yeah. And
Yep.
so as people know, that for a lot of people, the selective, like when I first signed up for the selective service, I thought it was pretty much required, but it's really not. It's required to do a lot of things in this country.
Well, it's
It's
required to
required.
get federal student loans.
Yes.
So
And
I'm
isn't
already
it
part of
isn't it required to get a driver's license or to get other identification?
it. Driver's license, yes. I remember I had to check that box. Yeah.
So it's a pretty serious thing, and to not be signed up for it is pretty limiting. And I guess for people who don't know, the selective service is the idea that you're agreeing that if the draft is reinstated, that you can be considered for it.
Yep.
And so it's a peacetime thing. We haven't had a draft since
Vietnam.
1974. I'm trying to think when. 72, probably maybe. I think we haven't had a draft in 50 years,
Right.
50 plus years. And they used to. I didn't even know this. I was informed about this. They had peacetime drafts up in between the Korean War and Vietnam, and in between World War II and the Korean War.
I didn't know that.
They
Interesting.
just drafted at a much, much lower rate.
Yeah. You see, once
So
again,
now,
I'm
yeah,
like okay with the draft if it's a war I support. And I know, like, oh, well, no shit. Like, then you wouldn't even need to be drafted. You would just volunteer. Yeah. But I don't like the idea of forcing young Americans to go fight in a war that not only they don't support, because fine, maybe they don't support it, but like a vast percentage of the country does not support either.
yeah, and that was the issue with Vietnam. And
Right.
that's the other thing where it's like it's hard because people will have these old World War II era ideologies about like how to support your country. But World War II was such a different conflict than the ones that we've had following it, where it
Yes.
was like it was very important for the United States to help defeat Hitler and to defeat the Japanese, because
Absolutely.
what they were threatening and what they were undertaking was something that would have affected the entire world and could have had horrible long-term effects on the country. Then you look at something like Vietnam, where it was built into our antiquated ideas of colonialism, and our antiquated and in the not even antiquated but in the moment incorrect beliefs on communism and socialism, and our
Yeah.
foreign policy is a reflection of that. And then you
So
look today, yeah, I
and
think
Korea, and Korea, same thing.
yes,
Mhm.
Korea, same thing. Part of the Korean War, it's a difficult thing. We're lucky that we didn't fight China on that. and that's when we quit. But like today, looking at today, I don't know. I think that unless with a few exceptions potentially, that the idea of the draft is really a huge violation of people's civil liberties and their rights.
Yeah.
And it's just shocking to me how many people, like older people, people in Congress, seem to support this idea of potentially bringing it back, especially because it's like, well, why are you guys urgent to bring it back like right now?
Yeah.
And it's
Very
like,
suspicious.
and
Our
so I mean,
our generation is going to grow up and become what we despise. Like right now, these people were younger when Vietnam was happening. They opposed the draft. Now they're older, retired in government, and they're supporting the draft. Is that what's to become of us?
I don't know. Another thing, we're talking about this right now, and like a lot of people who oppose the draft, who there's a lot of ways to just not go if you had the resources to.
True. Yeah, wars are
It's like,
fought.
oh, if you go to college, people were getting PhDs because of it.
Yeah.
They're like,
Yeah.
and like draft dodging was seen as kind of acceptable. I mean, obviously through the Vietnam War is where we had the introduction of different types of conscientious objection. I believe it was during the Vietnam War, there was the first example where the United States ended up allowing somebody to conscientiously object without religious reasons. And that was a big deal. And so it'll be interesting to see how that works from a legal perspective, in the future. But it is just wild to me. And it's wild that it's even something to talk about. And another thing that's occurring, I think, is there are schools that have, or there's a selective service exam that you take to determine both not really aptitude, but what type of position and roles you would fit in with the government.
Interesting.
Not in the government, in the military, in the different branches.
And
I believe some school, it's not required to take. So like if you went to a public school and they told you to take it, I believe you have the right to decline and the right to say that I'm not taking this exam. But I believe some lawmakers are trying to make it like a required testing. And so it just feels like we're ramping up for something, which I know is silly because if you look at the prior wars we've been involved in, the draft has always been reactive, not proactive.
Right. Yep. Good point. Yep. They do it after the war starts because they need more people. Great point.
Yeah. And so this is a weird case where it almost feels like people are being proactive about stuff as if some great conflict is going to occur. Like imagine us going to fight Russians. Like how silly is that?
Very silly.
Like imagine us going, like starting World War III.
Yeah, I think that given America's current posture on the world stage, it's more likely that we start World War III than are dragged into it. So
yeah, I think it's more likely we're an active participant in the propulsion of it.
What's so I'm gonna use the word lovely or like glamorous about the story of World War I and World War II is that if you could kind of imagine like America as a person being like, oh, like I don't really want to get involved. Like it's happening over there. It's not my business. And then once we do get involved, we just crush everybody. The story of World War III, if it happens, is not going to be that. It's not going to be America's reluctance to join the conflict. It's not going to look like that.
And if a person looks at World War I and World War II, you see the United States as a very nationalistic, isolationist nation. And that was something that Americans supported, and it was the type of political position that got people elected. And it was in some ways broadly popular. And then following World War II, you have like the installation of the Marshall Plan, and then you have all this involvement in Cold War, and you have all of this involvement with Europe, and after everything. But also following World War II, we had great, less industrial, but still industrial and economic boom from the way the world was changed after World War II and our involvement in changing it, like through the Marshall Plan. I mean, through the buybacks, the industry that we had that was propelled during World War II, our ability to further globalization and to further trade and have trade advantages and these have these large advantages over these other countries. Like a lot of it sets the stage for America becoming very, very, very invested into globalism.
Yep.
And then now, in a lot of ways, we are kind of seeing the consequences of that, both in America's own economy and also the world economy. And you can see stuff like Richard Nixon's trip to China and the opening of Pandora's box, as some people call it. And you can see these ways in which the United States has changed. And like, I don't know, will there be a World War III? If there is, it probably won't look anything like World War II or World War I, as you noted. But I will think it will be, you'll be able to, like you can for most of history, trace the causes.
Mm-hmm.
And it's not going, but in the same way, like when people look at World War I, they say, oh, it happened because Archduke Franz Ferdinand was assassinated.
Yeah.
And that's not, I find that to be a sort of dishonest way of saying that.
Very simplistic. Yeah. It's the straw that broke the camel's back. That's all it is.
Exactly. The gun that, what's his name? I'm not going to waste time on it. Picule, the guy.
I forget his name too. It's okay.
Anyways, that was like, in some ways, was the starting gun. That it was the sign for things to begin. But it did not, and it did have a lot of influence, and it did cause a lot of the conflict. But it was much more complicated than that, because that assassination, didn't even occur in one of the Central Powers, and we're not going to get into the World War I history.
Yeah,
but
it was
I think
the guy who got assassinated in Serbia, which was a rebellious region of what that World War I, that'd be the Austro-Hungarian Empire, right?
Yep, and they fell after that.
Yeah, exactly.
Well, I guess in one way you could argue that in World War I, a lot of that happened because there were these, a lot of places had converted into nation states, and a lot of places would become nation states following that, as opposed to these traditional kingdoms. Serbia, and you saw, yes, and then you even see, the power of kings in places like Germany and Russia, and you see things changing with that. I mean, I think you could see a comparison if there was a quote unquote World War III. The idea that, for America, like with what's happening with Ukraine and what's happening with Israel, America is like quote unquote allies with these countries and has is a vested interest in the outcome of the conflict as it pertains to them. And in some ways you could maybe see the U.S. getting dragged into it, in the sense that we have a responsibility, like to our shareholders, on almost like to our allies, and that there's economic opportunities that lead and snowball into war.
Yes, I think. I'm going to add on.
We don't need to we don't need to. I don't want to speculate too much.
Sure.
And I'm not trying to be a prophet, and I'm not trying to look like an idiot either.
I'll just tie a bow on that conversation. I think what you're actually getting at there is that countries like Israel and Taiwan and Japan, these countries are really just colonies of the United States. I mean, yeah, they have their own independent elections, whatever, but like, we have troops there. We occupy them. We have close economic ties. So going back to what you said earlier about antiquated ideas of colonialism in the Vietnam War, I think our government took a step back and said, you know what? These ideas are antiquated, but we still like colonialism and the benefits it brings to the host country. So how can we revamp the colonialism model? And I think that what you're discussing and the economic interests that snowball to war, what you're really getting at is that the United States, if you look at a map of the United States, it's much bigger than we would think. It includes Japan. It includes all of Western Europe, etc. So I think that's what you're kind of getting at. Yeah. Do you want to? I'm sure you want to say something on that.
Yeah. No, I agree, and I think, I don't know, like agree is a word. It's like I agree that that's a very interesting idea, and there's a lot of merit to it, and it makes sense. Obviously, the world is more complicated than what we're discussing, even though we're speaking in terms of complications. And I think there's a lot of things that we're unaware of things that both we have the ability to be aware of and things that we don't have the ability to be aware of.
Yeah.
But I like that idea of we're still seeing these effects of this belief system, and we're still seeing like first, second, and third world. And the idea that we're a first world nation.
Oh, yeah. Oh,
and
yes.
now China has almost taken the mantle of a second world nation.
Yep.
As opposed to Russia.
I wasn't following, but I totally.
Yeah, no, I understand because those terms have changed. But if you look at how they've changed too, and how things have become a reflection of we're talking about economic colonialism, like these third world countries are these countries that we kind of pillage and we ruin the economic capabilities of for our own personal gain.
True. Yeah. Were you the one that taught me? This might have been you, but that the original definition of first world, second world, and third world just meant first world meant allied with the United States, second world meant allied with the USSR, and third world was unaligned. I believe that was the
yes. So that's the origin of it, and I think it might more specifically like first world was pretty much just the US, second world was pretty much the USSR, but I think it also like first world included, the cult, because it was about culture in a lot of ways, and like what was available. So like first world is the US, and then like the Western Europe, which became heavily influenced by the US, and then second world is the states occupied by the USSR, and then I think some people would define China in it. I think it got broad, talking about the communist countries. So like I believe China, but I think China was just considered third world. And third world did not mean, because now it means a first world country is a developed nation,
right?
And a third world country is a impoverished developing nation.
Or undeveloped. And I think second world would be developing.
But we barely even use second world. You either refer to something as first world or third world. Like I've never heard someone go, this is like a second world country.
You know what? I've actually heard most of South America be referred to as second world.
Most of what?
South America in conversation.
Okay. Interesting. I've heard people refer it to just as third world, or being like, oh, I'm surprised it's like a first world country.
What we're both getting at is that the definitions are kind of antiquated. So
yes, they're antiquated.
Society and decide what the terms even mean anymore.
Or not.
Just put them to bed. Yeah. Would this be a good time for me to cycle into the CPI numbers? Just kind of hit on those for a minute, or no?
Yeah, because we've been focusing on, foreign policy as it relates to American policy, as it relates to American history. And I think the point I was getting at is that a lot of our foreign policy is heavily motivated by economics.
Of course. Yes.
And, but that being said, our two most recent, to set up what you're about to talk about, our two most recent conflicts that we've had involvement are in, some of the biggest criticisms is the amount of money that we have dedicated to those causes without there even being, and I know you obviously should not go to war for financial gain or support a war for financial gain, but the United States is not even supporting these wars for financial gain. You could argue Ukraine, there's an idea of financial gain down the road, but overall for Ukraine and Israel, a lot of these are just complete money pits.
It's a money pit. Yep.
And now something that we're experiencing is there is a debate over whether or not our economy is good.
Right. So, and that debate comes from, in part, the large amount of money that has been printed and injected into the economic system to fund these wars. I think that
COVID. I think you should also.
Yeah. I think like when it comes to war, there's like two reasons that are tried and true to go to war. One is security, like you've been attacked or you're anticipating a future attack. And the second would be resources, like natural resources to survive, right? Well, as you kind of mentioned, this war in Israel is certainly not for either of those. And Ukraine is Ukraine's on the other side of the world. If Russia were to take Ukraine, that wouldn't actually threaten the United States. Okay. But what happens when we print money? Well, we print money, we put it in the system, and then you have a bunch of people who argue about the impact of doing such a thing. But the result is so obvious. So the Biden administration and the government at large has published that the May CPI month over month is 0%. which means that from April to May of 2024, inflation is 0%. So prices didn't rise on average.
Yeah, it's an
But
effect. It's effectively zero.
effectively zero, right? So in
Now,
some areas, prices went down and some went up.
and now as to what you're saying, inflation has not reverted back to 0%.
Of course
And
not.
it's not reverted back to 0% since it has. We are no longer increasing at a decreasing rate or increasing at an increasing rate. We just have a stable rate of inflation.
Well, that's what the government would argue, but I would disagree with that notion.
Okay, so but that's what the government is saying. That's the point I was making. I'm
So
not
the
saying that's
government
my
is saying
personal
that-
opinion.
Yeah, the government is saying that inflation has stabilized and they're pointing to this 0% number. But if that's month over month, so they're looking at the change in prices on average in a 30-day period. But if you look at the inflation year over year, so May of 2024 compared to May of 2023, inflation is 3.3%. That's terrible. Like that's not good at all. And then you extrapolate that, right? So I mean, for anyone in the crowd with a calculator, right? You whip out the calculator and you take your price and you multiply it by 1.033, and you just see the impacts of this inflation and all this money printing. And also, you got to think about the CPI only measures consumer goods.
Yeah,
Okay?
it's a terrible system for measuring these things because it leaves out one of the most important things, obviously, besides food, that is being brought up as a reflection of inflation has been
rent, home prices, and car
utilities,
prices.
and car stuff, and none of that is included in a traditional CPI, right?
That's right.
And not only that, they assume, are there not assumptions that if the price of something, like when they're creating a CPI, and you'll correct me because I might be not completely on task here and correct, but that when they're creating a CPI, they're creating that basket of consumables, right?
Yep.
That the assumption that they make is that when the price of something becomes so high or too high, that people will substitute those goods.
Oh yeah. Okay. Yes. So you're talking about hedonics and substitutions.
Yes.
So we'll hit on both of those. We'll do one at a time. So I'll do substitutions first because that's what you just mentioned. So built into the CPI, we'll say, well, if the price of burgers, for example, like a burger, patties increases by too much, then consumers are more than happy to substitute with a hot dog.
Yeah.
So let's take these two products that we deem equivalent, and whichever one increased in price less, we will use that number. So if burgers went up by 5% and hot dogs went up by 2%, we're going to use hot dogs. We're going to substitute hot dogs with burgers. And that obviously makes no sense because clearly the quality of these two goods is not comparable.
Not only is the quality not comparable, the good isn't necessarily comparable.
Yeah, right. That's not a good point.
You gave, I think hot dogs and burgers is a good example because it's like those are two different products. And they do that with consumables.
They are two different products, but they are used as substitutions for each other.
Of course. But I'm saying it becomes a slippery slope in using that. And then also the thing was, when we bring up rent, utility, car payments, those are things that you cannot really substitute.
True.
And so that's part of why the use of the CPI is so poor, because not only is the system because really, if you look to like a big thing, Paul Krugman, I think I'm saying his name right, famed economist. I think he's pretty bad at his job.
Agreed. He worked for Clinton, right?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not going to talk about what he was like 20 to 30 years ago. I'm talking about him currently. Like, he's written textbooks. He has obviously a great fundamental concept for economics.
He's a Keynesian.
He would probably destroy me in a conversation. But like I will look at his tweets. And one recent thing he said that I thought was very it was a very poor, obtuse observation regarding the rise in fast food prices, because a lot of both consumer data and polling data about fast food prices is the belief that they've gotten too high and has now become almost like a luxury item, or people have been priced out of them. And what he noted, though, is that even though that's happened, is that spending in fast food has not really decreased. So the idea that it's these people's fault. And then just like something to my counterpoint of that argument is, with fast food, you can obviously substitute different fast food restaurants, but obviously they're all in lockstep with how much they're increasing prices. The
Yep.
thing is that people who eat fast food, obviously a lot of people who eat fast food are capable of making and buying their own food, and making and purchasing your own food and purchasing ingredients to make food is cheaper than fast food. It was cheaper than fast food when fast food costed a lot less.
Mhm.
The issue that someone like Krugman is missing here is that people don't have the lifestyle. They do not have a lot of these. There are a lot of people who don't have the ability to cook. Like they don't know how.
True.
And like the way their lifestyle is determined, it's determined and set up around something like fast food. Like
Yeah.
it's like understandably you could say, well, there are substitutions to this, but functionally for a lot of people it isn't a substitution because they don't know how else to eat, because they
Yeah,
don't know how to cook.
the lack of home skills is probably one of the biggest red flags for our entire generation.
Well, and
I
people don't have,
Yeah, I don't know how to cook. It's crazy.
and people don't like to waste time, not waste time, but the fast part of fast food has not changed that much. Obviously, it is not as inexpensive as it once was, but it is still very quick and very convenient. And that is
Yeah.
something that is built into people's schedules, it's built into their lifestyles. And so even with these price increases, obviously people should be moving away from fast food for a number of reasons.
But they won't.
But not only will they won't,
They
it's like I don't know how capable people are of doing it.
Yeah.
And I'm not trying to take away agency from people, but it's just this idea where, and then his takeaway is that people are it's that they're choosing not to and choosing to spend more. And then that's a sign that the economy is actually not that bad. In the same way that people are like, oh, well, people are willingly spending all this money on rent or putting all this money into their car payments. And it's like, it's not that willing.
One of the greatest lies is when someone tries to convince you that prices have increased and that's a good thing. Like that just makes no sense, no matter how you try to spin it or argue it. And that goes back to hedonics with technology. Consistently in the CPI report, consistently, one of the consumer categories that drags down the inflation rate is technology prices. So they'll say, well, technology has decreased by 2% this month. So that's one of the, like, if you can bet on any category to have decreased in price, it's going to be technology. But that is called hedonics. And what hedonics says is, well, the quality of the good has increased disproportionate to the increase in price. For example, this phone, I know, and that is how you should react.
Yeah, so because that's an argument that is made, but is a fundamental lie.
Exactly. So they'll say, for example, the quality of this iPhone has increased by 10% since last year. The new iPhone is 10% better. And by the way, you're saying, well, what does that mean? How do you measure the 10%? They'll say, oh, well, the consumer experience is 10% better. The phone will last 10% longer. They don't say that because that's obviously false. But whatever. But then they'll say the price of the iPhone increased by 5%, but the quality increased by 10%. That's actually a negative 5%. And that's called hedonics. And that's a complete nonsensical argument. But you'll consistently see, like, if there's one category that you're going to bet on a decrease in the price level, it's going to be technology in the CPI report. But like, if you go to the store and you're looking to buy a 4K TV, you're going to drop like a few $100.
Yeah.
So
for the bad one, I mean, that's the quality of that TV, like its ability to last, its resilience is going to be horrible.
Exactly. But they'll say, oh, well, it looks prettier than 1080p. So therefore, there's actually an increase in quality. It's like, no, that is called innovation. And back in the day, we used to produce innovation and prices would still fall. But now all of a sudden, when we innovate, that's an excuse for prices rising.
Well, an example of this, and sometimes, it's like, I think innovation should lead to price increases if somebody wants to, but the issue is when innovation results in something becoming cheaper to produce and to manufacture, and then that not being reflected. And so the famous example of this is CDs being far more expensive to purchase than, I guess, not 8-tracks.
VHS?
Well, CDs, DVDs, all of that stuff was cheaper to make than cassette tapes. That's what I'm thinking of, cassette tapes. So a CD costs a lot less money to make than a cassette tape. But when CDs came out, because they were seen as an innovation, the pricing on them, they were charged. They're being sold for a lot more than the price of a cassette tape, even though it cost a lot less to manufacture and to produce and to put out.
Mm.
So that's an example where it's like there was an innovation that occurred, but because there was not what's it called, perfect information.
Yeah, a free
There was
market.
not exactly there was not perfect information, whereas like you had to be really, I guess, educated, or I don't even know if it was available information to know that a CD cost that less, because they're not going to say that and sell it for more. And I'm sure the quality was better,
Mhm.
but I don't know how proportionate it was to the price increase for an item that cost far, far less to make. And I
Mhm.
believe once that became public knowledge, that like the prices of CDs dropped. And
Okay.
and now today they're pretty cheap. I mean, they're not even a part of our lives anymore.
Right. That's why they're so cheap. I mean, a lot of these new movies that come out, I used to, I'm one of those people that if I saw a really good movie, I would buy it on Blu-ray. That's what I used to
Mm-hmm.
do. But number one, a lot of these new movies don't even go to Blu-ray. That's number one. But number two, like my Xbox doesn't even have a CD drive anymore.
A disc drive. Yeah, you can't even
Like that's
play it.
yeah, like so I had, my old Xbox, they would advertise cross forward compatibility. Like you could use
Yeah,
a game from an old console on the new one. But then I got the new console, it's like, wait, there's no disk drive. Like how
backwards compatibility. Yeah.
yeah, compatibility. Thank you. But it was like only if you own the game digitally because there's no longer a disk drive. So, everything is now streaming and that's a separate discussion. But what
So
we're
your
both
your statement on this, I guess, like I don't know if we're heading into like a coda, but your idea is not just that the CPI reports are wrong, but the
Mhm.
way in which they are wrong. What do you think? How should people, in your mind, from your perspective and your reading of the CPI reports, how should people actually feel about the cost of goods? I guess the cost of consumables, the cost of things like rent and car payments and utilities, and like how should people be like respond to that? Because the argument from the Biden administration is that people are fundamentally wrong in how they feel about the economy.
Right. That is their argument. The argument is that people
People are just wrong.
are wrong about how they feel. But I think, and like my answer is going to sound super simplistic, but just like look around, look at your grocery bill. I went food shopping for the family yesterday. I got 5 bags of items. It was $91. That's a lot of
Mm-hmm.
money for 5 plastic bags of goods. It was mostly fruit. Like what's going on here? So it's just crazy. 2 pounds of salmon, $25. I'm basically accurate on that. That's way too much. I mean, what is going on?
We even look
So
at something like the price of eggs, which was always and they
yeah,
they obviously had a recent price jump that I think has started to
Mhm.
come down, because there was a moment where a dozen eggs was $2.
But now it's like if you want the nice eggs, like if you want the eggs that are orange inside and not yellow, like you want a nice healthy egg, you're gonna drop like $8 on like 12 eggs. It's completely insane. Or six
So,
bucks on 12 eggs.
yeah. So if you could make one policy decision,
Mhm.
like what is the or let's put this another way and be less hypothetical. What is the biggest policy decision or factor of the way that the Fed is running, or the US government or the executive branch or Congress is operating, that is creating this inflation?
Okay,
Like
I
what is
would
the
say,
biggest perpetrator, if there
yep,
is a biggest one?
there is. So I
Okay.
would say that as of next year, the Federal Reserve cannot increase the M2 money supply. And you would
Hmm.
see just like that how fast everything changes. Because once they can't increase the money supply, first off, the government would be forced to balance their budget. That's number
And you're
one.
saying you're saying just M2. So you're referring to, which I guess M2 includes M1, right?
Yeah.
So M2
So
includes M1,
yeah, so physical
and
currency, that's M1.
yes, that's
And
M1, and then M2 includes bonds,
yep. And then
bonds,
M3 is
T-bills.
derivatives.
Yes. So,
But
but you're making an emphasis on the fact that the U.S. government will heavily rely on what, the issuing of bonds.
yeah, as they currently do. Yes.
Yes, and you're saying that if they would stop that, we would see a big impact on inflation.
Well, right, because what the government does right now is the federal government issues bonds, and those bonds are purchased by the Federal Reserve with printed money. But you
Yes.
could argue that the Federal Reserve is a arm of the government.
They won't, but we will argue that.
But
Yes.
I would. So,
Yes.
because their policy is directly impacted by what the president says, right? So
Yes.
and like the president literally picks the head of the Federal Reserve. M3 money supply the government can't control. It's derivatives.
Yes. Derivatives is not. Yeah.
I'm not even implying that they should control that. But what I'm saying is the government needs to balance its budget by stopping the issue of new bonds. Or, I mean, at the very least, stopping the new issue of bonds that could be purchased by the Federal Reserve. I mean, that'd be the end of QE. That's what that would be. So
yeah, the quantitative easing, because through the purchasing of those bonds, that leads to a heavy, in the case of when the Federal Reserve is buying these bonds, a heavy increase in the money supply, correct?
yes, and it decreases interest rates, which
Yes.
distorts the market. So even right now, if you look at the yield curve, so the interest rate curve, the 6-month interest rate is approximately 5.5%. That's basically right. The 1-year interest rate is like 5.1. That should not be happening. As duration increases, interest rates should also increase.
But you're saying because they're issuing more and more bonds and that's lowering the interest rates, that means that these interest rates are now going below these earlier issuances.
That's right. Yep.
Yeah.
Because the Fed is buying the 30-year bonds and dragging the tail end of the curve
down because the purchasing of those bonds is decreasing the interest rate.
That's right. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. So there we go.
That would be my answer. I mean, once you get the government to balance its budget, and yeah, that's going to mean an increase in taxes, or it's going to mean a decrease in government spending. And fine, the politicians can fight about what that looks like. But at the end of the day, I hate to say it, but it's true. I would rather pay more taxes than see the printing of money, because the printing of money is an evil force that corrodes an economy from the inside. At least with taxes, people know it's happening, and then they complain. So,
well, I guess that's another argument you could make, is that if they put this onto taxation, it would probably be people could have more of a more direct line in being able to blame the government, because like most Americans don't understand. And like I was starting to remember from economics classes what you were referring to and talking about that system in place. And I obviously wanted you to be very clear about it too, for anybody who's listening who might not have that background. Yeah. But like for most Americans, that isn't something that you're able to pontificate or speak about.
Sure. I mean, I just kind of gave
like most Americans can, I'm saying like most Americans can't talk about what you just talked about, but most Americans can talk about taxes reasonably.
Of course. Yeah.
And whether or not they're paying more or less than them.
Right. You know, and the people who do want higher taxes, they want it for someone else, not for themselves. So, you know, it's a very easy concept to understand. Absolutely. I mean, the whole idea of what we've been describing, what I've been describing, gets into like the modern economic theory of MMT, you know, modern monetary theory.
Monetary theory.
Even Krugman, who I disagree with on a lot of things, even Krugman dislikes and disagrees with MMT.
MMT, yeah.
He knows it's a destructive force. Krugman is a Keynesian, right?
Yes.
So he believes.
But he's not a post Keynesian or Keynesian, whatever you want to say.
I'm gonna say, I guess it's Keynesian technically. Yeah, he's not right. So he's a traditional Keynesian who believes in globalism. But even Krugman acknowledges the dangers of money printing. So, you know, that is why Krugman himself even has a lot of objections with what the government is doing today. Yeah.
And so probably if in a future episode, we could talk more about quantitative easing.
Sure.
I mean, obviously it's permanently relevant, and it's because it's not like, quantitative easing just happened, but we could probably talk about it and discuss more on it when more comes up with it. I think we'll see more of it as the election comes up and then following the election.
True that. True. Absolutely. And, you know, if you want to, and I'll end by saying this, if you want to look at the long-term devastating impacts of QE, all you have to do is look at Japan, because they invented it.
Yep.
And I'll end there with that. This
There we
has been
go.
great.
Hey, we talked about social issues with the
Yeah.
election. We talked about foreign policy, and then we talked about economics.
We hit all
You
three.
know,
That's
we
great.
hit all three. It wasn't entirely purposeful, but I think it was a good flow. And hopefully, who are listening, if you're listening in order to be informed, I hope we did a good job, and I hope we were honest and fair enough. I know we didn't make any ill attempts to lie or
Of course not.
to sow seeds of distrust in people, but I'm sure there are some details we got wrong, but I feel like we were pretty broadly accurate and fair on whatnot.
Yeah, we were closer to right than wrong in all cases.
I would like to think so. I would like to think we are at least pointing in the direction of what we believe to be right, even if that is not the right direction.
Absolutely.
So I'm sure we'll have more to speak on soon. I believe the next time we talk, we can talk about the first debate and we can focus on that because obviously it will be relevant. And, we're going to attempt to publish these types of episodes semi-frequently because we want to focus on current events.
Yeah.
I mean, we might, if we get any feedback on episode length or topics to discuss, we can also include that. I think, what are we running at?
For
Probably, probably. I think this episode is around hour and a half, which is good. It might be a bit on the longer end.
Yeah.
And we're really aiming, I think, in a perfect world, we could do like an hour. We're never going to be like the New York Times podcast.
Oh, I haven't even. They have a daily podcast. Interesting.
Okay. Yeah, it's short, and it's designed. It's like an NPR type of thing.
Oh yeah,
get your news. We're not that, obviously, for a number of reasons. We're not journalists. We speak for long periods of times.
Yeah, and you mentioned podcast frequency. Obviously, since we've started this, life has become a lot more complex and interesting for the both of us.
Yes.
So, you are speaking Arabic now, so congrats to that. So now everyone in the audience knows. We've got a fluent Arab speaker on the other side.
Not fluent, but that's okay.
Oh, right. Thomas says he's not fluent, but he's really good. So yeah.
Thank you, Nick. Yeah.
Yeah, you are.
A lot has changed. We've both graduated from college.
Yep.
We're both in that next stage of our lives. You'll see if you look back at our old episodes, which will be available in some way, that a lot of our perspectives on things have changed. I think we've cooled a lot. I think we are less about, here's how we can just change things and fix things. And I think we are probably both much less interested in social issues.
Yeah.
In a way, I think we're more interested in how the discussion and the organization around social issues.
Yes. And how chaotic it is. Absolutely. But like the actual, like for abortion, you kind of mentioned that a few times. I have absolutely zero interest in that issue. Like, I just don't feel like I have a dog in the race, a horse in the race.
Yeah, and we're definitely, dog in the fight, a horse in the race. And we're two men, unmarried. Like it's not a thing. We're not women. It's not a personal issue to us.
Right.
And so I think it's a good thing that we're less interested in those kinds of things, in those debates and like the cultural wars.
Mm-hmm.
And I like being able to talk about these kinds of topics, which like I said, we talked about things that will probably not be that much of a function of the debate.
Yeah. And what's also interesting is what I've learned is if you go into because I work in corporate, like in corporate, you can talk about economic issues and it's totally socially acceptable and you're considered intelligent for doing
and
so.
You can say bad, I'm not going to say horrific, but you could say kind of repulsive things about how you believe an economy should run.
Yeah.
Run and face no pushback because the implications of what you're talking about could be horrible things, but it doesn't really matter. It's not something that people are going to strike you down for.
Right. Like a social issue comment. Exactly.
And I'm not saying things should be one way or the other. I'm just commenting on how it's funny and how our politicians are far less focused on this. And, our society, social media, our interactions, and it's not a criticism. Politicians, it's a criticism, but for general society, it's I think a lot of it is symptomatic.
Yep.
And it's just the way the world works, and due to a lot of factors beyond people's control or understanding. And so I guess to wrap up, we'll try to do another one of these episodes soon.
Absolutely.
We'll have to plan for it in our lives and whatnot, but hopefully people enjoyed. Hopefully it wasn't too long or too short, and that we covered everything. And just I hope that everyone has a good day. I hope you have a good day, Nick.
Yeah, you too, Thomas. Cheers, everybody.
Hopefully I'll get this uploaded soon enough and we can get our new system of how we're going to do this all figured out.
Yeah, we'll get it. Bye, everyone.
All right. Bye.